Oh. Great. I think I'm going to start since we're all here and here very much on time. So welcome to everyone for today's event, being organized, the Conference on the Constitution and 50 Years of Bangladesh, being organized by University of the Asia Pacific, the South Asian Institute for Advanced Legal Studies and Human Rights, and the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust. I'm Sarah Hussain. I'm here on behalf of BLAST and delighted to welcome you to today's session. Some of you will have already been at the first session this morning. This is our second session, and we're looking forward to having a third session tomorrow morning and hope you'll join us at that as well. In today's session, we're going to look at the issue of women and legal consciousness. And particularly, we think this is particularly important because today, not only are we here in December celebrating 50 years of Bangladesh's independence, we're having today's discussion on the 10th of December on International Human Rights Day. And we're focusing this conference, one of the issues on which we're focusing this conference is on gender equality and the promise of gender equality that was incorporated in our constitution in 1972. And that came out of the experiences of before liberation, the movements for independence and autonomy, but also very much the experiences of the independence war itself. The experiences of women as fighters, but the experience of women as victims and survivors of sexual violence, and how that entire experience informed the situation of Bangladesh as it came out of the conflict and began its journey to be a new nation. We've organized this conference because we thought it was a really important moment for us to, like the rest of the country, look back on what's been achieved, look back at how much of those ideals and promises that were there in the Constitution in 1972 have been fulfilled, how far we've gone down that path, and to look forward to see what are the possibilities in front of us now. In this session today, we're going to look, as I said, at the issue of women's legal consciousness. We have two paper presenters who are going to speak to us from very different perspectives. One around looking at the Bangladeshi legal framework, how much that has matched up to the constitutional promises, and also importantly, looking at organizing and mobilizing of feminist activists and how that has informed the process and catalyzed the process. That presentation will be by Shadika Haq Monia, and I'll introduce her in a moment. Our other speaker is Jaya Yadav. Jaya will be speaking to reflections based on her analysis of two works of literature, looking again at the experiences of women in the context of conflict, very different women in different conflicts, and what occurred to them during and afterwards within their families and their communities. They're different papers, but I think really complementary papers, and I hope they're going to catalyze a very interesting conversation for us today. We're also very fortunate to be joined by our two panelists and discussants, Dr. Faustina Pereira and Dr. Shahnaz Huda, who are known to everybody here, but I'm going to introduce them with their all of their incredible achievements when we come to hear from them. The structure for today's discussion is we'll hear from the two speakers, the two presenters. We'll then hear from our two panelists, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions, answers, and open discussion from everybody who's here. I believe our session is also on Facebook and also going on YouTube. I hope we're going to be collecting some questions from there as well. And I really encourage everybody to please bring your experiences into the conversation, raise any questions and any concerns that you have so that we can have as engaged a session as possible. So with no further ado, let me go to introduce Shadika first, our first speaker. Shadika Haq Monia is currently a lecturer of law at Notre Dame University in Bangladesh. She was earlier a lecturer also of law, of course, at Britannia University in Comilla. She had won the SARC's Silver Jubilee Scholarship and used that to do a 2 years master's degree at the South Asian University in New Delhi. And she was also a participant at an intellectual property law summer school in Xiamen University in China, where again, she had a scholarship. She's published in a number of papers, participated in many conferences. She also has some expertise in refugee policy, international human rights law, in humanitarian law, constitutional law. We'll be hearing from Shadika in a moment. I'm just going to turn to our first speaker. Sorry, there's a bit of confusion there. To Jaya Yadav. Jaya is currently a PhD scholar at the University of Delhi, and she's working on contemporary South Asian literature. Her MPhil thesis was on fiction, entitled Seas and Cities, exploring the history of trade, colonialism, and scientific enterprise in Amitav Ghosh's The Calcutta Chromosome and the Ibis trilogy. She received her bachelor's from Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi and her master's in MPhil from the University of Delhi. And her work is focused very much on the interdisciplinary aspects of literature and its role in the questions of how identity, history, and politics are shaped, formed, and discussed. Over to you, Jaya, for our first presentation.
Thanks so much, Hussein. Just want to say before I begin, it's such an honor and privilege to be here for the 50th celebration. And my own family spent over, I think, 4 years living in Dhaka between Gulshan and Baridhara. So I haven't been back since COVID, but I've been to Dhaka multiple times. And I'm just going to begin my presentation, but truly such a delightful place to be in today on, this very special year. So I'm just going to share my presentation and people can probably send in their questions as we go along. Please feel free to write them in the chat. What I am primarily looking at is, because my training is in literature, I look at the role of literature in identifying how we create memories, how we create identities, and how that's also linked to law. So the title of my paper is, sorry, just a second. It's looking at women in war through Themina Anam's The Good Muslim and Akila Ismail's novel of Marigold and Martyrs. And we begin by, before we jump into actually looking at Bangladesh in contemporary fiction, because both of these authors are writing in today's time, it's good to get a reference of undivided colonial India. Because what we see nations and nationalities as today, most of us would be familiar with, these are newly formed borders. But often, we tend to take our time frame for the subcontinent from 1947 when the British decided to leave. So we begin with contemporary fiction from South Asia, which has now published, seen the publication of literature in English, especially on post-partition trauma. Lots of scholars have called for comparative readings of the subcontinent's partition in 1947. Though on paper, it appears to be a specific date, we are familiar with the fact that the erstwhile British Empire was divided into 3 geographical entities, West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan, which was also East Bengal as 2 nation states. But the reality of what was happening for people to gain quote unquote freedom or to quote unquote independence was people migrating from the wrong side of the border to the quote unquote the right side, to regions which would probably make them a majority. So in light of this, the central question that I'm looking at is, how do we then reimagine history through fiction as historiography? So how do we look at the process of history writing, which is historiography, as a space that can be used in fiction to look at the past and to bring both fact and fiction and actually blur those boundaries between these concepts that we have of reality versus fiction. So this is the partition of Bengal in 1905, which I think is a good reference to look at, especially because when we look at the space of Bengal as a whole, or the Bay of Bengal, the land and the sea, we do have to remember that, politics or divisions didn't begin in 1947, which is taken as like the central date for everything that happens in the subcontinent, even in literature. So we know the partition of Bengal was met with a lot of resistance from people from all these districts. There were numerous protests that broke out against the British at this time. And it really did consolidate, a Bengali identity, especially because when we're talking about literature, we also know that Bengali literature has had a very rich and ancient tradition of writing and theater as well. So this is just a map to remember and, reimagine that the starting point for Bengal is not actually 1947, but can be traced back to 1905, especially when we're talking about things like division and identity. So We know that this has been deconstructed in most recent scholarship, especially by Yasmin Saika, Bina Da Costa, who we're very lucky to have here today, Adina Siddiqui, and their work has focused on women and looking at history as an alternative space to record women survivors of sexual violence, genocide, and war. William Van Schendel also offers a very fresh insight into historiography, into reimagining South Asia. And for us, at least for me today, when I'm talking about these two novels, the power of literature to shape the memory of the war and the role that literature plays in the process of state formation is really important to use to understand larger issues of our time today. So this paper interlinks the role of literature in shaping and even questioning collective memory, especially in light of the 1971 Bangladesh War. It also raises the question that after the victory of Bangladesh, how much of the newly attained freedom translated for the women of the region? Did those who emerged victorious advocate for spaces which question their own role in the remaking of this new nation? Or are we still asking these questions even today? So before delving into Anam's The Good Muslim, we have to note that it's the sequel from the Golden Age, which foregrounds themes of identity, citizenship, and conflict. In the Golden Age, we get a distinct sense of the Bangladeshi struggle against the hegemonic powers of Pakistan, which control the economy and life of East Pakistan. So we have the Haqq family, who consist of the mother Rehana, her two children, Sohail and Maya, who've tragically been separated by a court which has declared Rehana unfit as a mother after the death of her husband. So the family history of the Haqq testifies to this interconnected and plural Bengali identity, as the reader finds out that Rehana's children have been sent to extended family in their home in Karachi. And Rehana herself had come from took Dhaka from Calcutta in 1947 after she got married. So the difference in moving to East Pakistan versus West Pakistan, even at that time, is a stark one. Rehana sees no clear distinction between the two sides of Bengal, although she belongs to an upper-class Urdu-speaking family, whereas her children in Karachi are met with a sense of alienation as they don't speak Urdu and their mother tongue is Bangla. So the novel articulates questions on the Bengali identity. For the first generation of Haqs, they adopt Bengali as the language, and they become Bengali through language acquisition. And then as the army arrives in Dhaka, the Haq's loyalties are questioned amidst the resistance movement. So Rehana by this time has been reunited with her children, and at times her allegiance to being Bengali is cross-examined by them. But it's important to know that Rehana's position first as a mother, way before 1971, as she lost custody of her children to the state Pakistan and not just a family, and then a widow committing herself to the cause of the liberation movements, makes her a very strong character. Her home becomes the refuge of Mukti Bahini soldiers, and Rehana extends help and protection to other Bengalis who are also fleeing Dhaka amidst violence. We also must remember that when we read literature in a larger framework, when we compare it to other literature from the 1947 partition, which often shows women as victims, The Good Muslim shows generations of Bangladeshi women asserting their agency in various ways. And they're very active participants in the struggle, and even after the war, they continue their commitment to other issues. And I think this image here is really important when we think about reimagining the war, even through a fictional lens, that you have women, at the center of armed forces and battle, and a lot of the images that come out of Bangladesh at that time don't show women, as weak or frail or only suffering, which is not to say that people weren't suffering at that time, across the region. But I think this image holds a lot of power to relooking at Anam's text as well, that any of these women can also be a character in the novel. So The Good Muslim, shows us, we see her son Sohail, who like other Bengali men, joins the Mukti Bahini, and Maya becomes a doctor, and during the war has to seek refuge in Calcutta, has now come back, and she's helping women in need of abortions after being assaulted by army men. So in a parallel reading of Religion and Nation, it becomes evident that the dream of the liberal, secular, democratic, regional nationalism imagined by Mujibur Rahman is enshrined in the constitution of Bangladesh. But in an overarching patriarchal Asian society, its effects into grassroots levels become a slow process. So soon after dissatisfaction with the ruling party, it paves way for military rule, and the constitution also gets altered with time in the parliament. So Maya's labeled as this crusading lady doctor, and she takes on the role of journalist. She grows apart from her brother, and she starts writing critically against the dictatorship. And she meets with her new friends who used to be revolutionaries during 1971, but to her, they become very materialistic people now, after 71. So Anam compares these historical events to real things that happened, which challenge traditional representations of war. Sikta Banerjee observes that, nationalism functions by idealizing masculinity and allotting women the role of carers and nurturers, and there's no place for women once the task of nation building commences. And women are envisioned as passive bystanders or victims and not as aggressive agents, which actually is challenged by this entire novel. Because in the novel, we also see this rape survivor, Pia, to interrogate the title of Virangana, and who's brought home by Sohail after the war, and Maya also tries to help her. So we see that there is acceptance by certain parts of society, but Pia herself isn't able to deal with the trauma and she runs away. So there's also the question to ask, in the new nation state, where do these women go who are tainted, who are labeled as tainted, and they don't have any space to share or overcome their trauma? And then this scene from Bangladesh's history is such an important one, because it shows that there was so much power, assimilating at that time amidst people. And, the whole war was actually based on the real people of the country who've come out in numbers to support Mujibur Rahman, or after Bangladesh's victory as well. And this is the scene that Maya remembers, when her friends have become materialistic and they've kind of lost their revolutionary fervor. So this is a sharp contrast to look at the people who have come out in support of Mujibur Rahman, look at their, struggle and their assertion. But what also happens to, normal people after the war gets over, and afterwards when they are less glorifying the whole process. So this, I also wanted to point out to this really important documentary, Rising Silence, which is based on the cause of the Biranganas. It's an attempt by Lisa Ghazi to record their history as she reimagines this through plays and through Bengali folk tales as well, and takes into account of women who have survived this and are still living today. So it's also reading the Bangladeshi war, not just through fiction, but we're also looking at other representations of the war. So Yasmin Saika is, a historian who's highlighted a lot of this in her work. And The Good Muslim exemplifies this failure of the listener and points to the question that where are the people who should be listening to these voices which have, been pushed to the sidelines? And the novel also points to this multifaceted Bengali identity and sheds light on the plurality between both pre and post-war Bangladesh. And it re-examines the liberation war. It becomes a counter-discourse and voice for women's silent voices. And it critiques that unquestioning romanticized glorification of war and shows that, the effects of war don't affect only women, they also affect men who become traumatized. And that, the bloodshed can't very easily be forgotten even afterwards. And I wanted to point to this text by Ian Cotter, which labels 1971 as an Indo-Pak War, just to talk about the power of words when we label the 1971 Liberation War as an Indo-Pak War, which, to many, it may seem incorrect because it takes away the contribution and the centrality of the Bangladeshi people in the war. So this is, I feel like, an alternative to reading Temina Anam's text, which, really puts Bangladeshi women at the center. So in a parallel novel, we see in Marigolds and Martyrs, there's, again, distinct sense of Bangladeshi struggle against Pakistan. And there's this whole question, which, even Amitav Ghosh's work echoes, how can anybody divide a memory? And it looks at other communities in Bangladesh at that time, Suri's family, who've come from places in Bihar and Nepal and Madhya Pradesh, who've sacrificed their lives in the 1952 language movement and very tragically died at the hands of the Pakistani army. And by the end of the novel, they're asking, are we not in our own homes? How can we be refugees? And we aren't in our homes, and that is what makes us refugees. So we can also use Kamal Sadiq's underlining of developing modern states as documentary citizenship, where, during war, people can be stripped of their citizenship, or even when they have state-sponsored citizenship by the community, by the constitution, the community doesn't allow them to access this. And we've seen this 2 days ago, in the UK, where they launched a citizen bill that any citizen could be stripped of their rights without a warning. So I think, the Constitution of Bangladesh asserts freedom on the basis of gender, religion, and background. And one must remember that the journey to attaining this freedom has always been a long struggle. And today also helps frame questions of women's rights and agency, not just in Bangladesh, but also South Asia, which at times is not always translated into reality. And then I wanted to give a reference to, of course, the Shahid Minar, which is a site of collective memory to think about how can Bangladeshi contemporary literature also become a site of collective memory where we have many voices, not just women's voices, we have men's voices, voices of other people, of even children who are represented in this fiction, about how they imagine the war. And, not just national monuments. So the novel acts as a site to chronicle historical amnesia and take the responsibility which shaped Bangladeshi nationalism. Fiction becomes this recollection of memory, or rather a recreation, which speaks to the future linked to the past of the partition and subsequent partitions, where in the quest for freedom, women across communities are the first victims of war and very often the most common. So Bangladesh's constitutional law offers this deeper analysis of framing women's rights and voices through legality, one which continues to resonate with women across South Asia. And I think that's really important to remember when we look at Bangladesh, that there is a strong constitution, there are, laws written very clearly, but how often do they really translate into reality for many women? So how does class for Bangladeshi women affect them? How does region, how does their language, how does this rural-urban divide change the way they can access these constitutional rights, which the Constitution guarantees? So thank you everybody.
Thank you so very much, Jaya. I think you've raised really interesting points for us in terms of what is the reach of the constitutional right to equality and the prohibition on discrimination. Firstly, who does it reach out to in any event, given that it's limited in its own terms? But whatever exists, how far can that actually be enforced and enjoyed? And we will come back to these points after we hear the discussants. Jaya, if you could just take the screen down, great, thank you. I'll just explain a bit for many of our participants. We are having this discussion in English because one of the purposes of this conference was to have this conversation within and outside Bangladesh with scholars from different jurisdictions, from different countries, who are from Bangladesh and from outside, who are looking at the developments that we've had in the country, but also looking at them within a kind of comparative perspective. So I'm sorry that today we actually don't have translation, which we often have, but I hope that everyone will feel quite free to, in the discussion and in the chat, to raise whatever points they want to in Bangla as well as English. I'll turn now to Shadika. Shadika, if you'd like to share your screen. I think you got a very good cue from Jaya in terms of you're now going to go into looking at what the legal framework in Bangladesh is in the light of the Constitution. Thanks, Shadika.
Is it visible, my screen?
That's great, thanks. If you can put it on slideshow, that would be really helpful.
Is it visible?
It's visible, it's visible, yeah. Just put it on slideshow if you can, so it's easier to see. Thanks, that's perfect. Over to you.
Welcome to all. Am I audible clearly?
You're audible, go ahead, just speak up a little bit.
Okay, welcome to all in my session. I'm Sadika Munia, lecturer in law at the University of Bangladesh. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for such a platform where we can talk, we can speak about feminism, women's rights, and our legal mechanism. So today is 10th December, obviously it's Human Rights Day. So I would like to wish you all happy Human Rights Day. And my presentation topic is law, feminism, and the Constitution of Bangladesh. So for the reason for choosing the topic, we are celebrating Golden Jubilee or the 15th years anniversary of the independence of Bangladesh. The Constitution of Bangladesh also became effective on the Bangladesh Victory Day in 16th December 1972. So it's really a high time to talk and evaluate women's rights situation of the country. So my presentation will focus on the feminist movement in Bangladesh in the light of constitutional and other domestic legal mechanisms. The study will only be limited to the state practice of Bangladesh. Okay, moving to the next slide. My first point is about the idea of feminism or feminist movement in Bangladesh. So actually, feminism or a feminist movement, it's not an idea which has derived from Bangladesh or the society from Bangladesh. It's not like this. It's a doctrine of equality between men and women, focusing on organizing women to prevent male domination over women. The feminist ideology is that women will have equal rights with men politically, socially, sexually, intellectually, and economically. Most of the women activists of Bangladesh claim women's legal rights such as the right to contract, right to property, marital rights, physical freedom and integrity, freedom of movement, including reproductive rights. Therefore, most Bangladeshi people have also negative perception about feminism and feminist practitioners, and most of the people think that it's male hatred. There are various misconceptions about feminism in Bangladesh, such as feminism referring to women wearing short pants, women with short ears, women smoking cigarettes, women hating men, and women hating families and marriage. So actually, the idea of feminism or feminist movement is completely detached from the others due to the culture, tradition, customs, and the social attitude of the Bangladeshi women. After 1971, the women's movement or the idea of feminism was included or restricted in the idea of women's political movement, women's political participation, economic empowerment, public policy, reformation of religious personal law, and the protection from violence against women. But in the 21st century, the feminist movement are involved in the issue such as violence against women, gender equality, economic opportunities, equal working opportunities, equal representation in politics, reproductive rights, family law reform, and gender equality in public policy. So the social reform movement mainly. So I should say this is the main point of my presentation. What are the constitutional mechanism regarding women rights or the feminist movement or feminism? There are some particular or specific mechanism regarding women's protection that I should say Article 28, equality before law, no discrimination against any citizens merely on the grounds of religion, caste, race, sex, or place of birth. Women and men shall enjoy equal rights in all walks of life or in the state of public life. All citizens shall have equal access to employment or position in the service of the Republic. Special provision should be enacted in favor of any backward section of the citizens so that the workers of the Republic may enjoy adequate representation, and women should be represented, reserved seat for women in the National Assembly, and Article 9 also stated about the representation in the development of local government institution as well. Okay, before going to analyze the present situation or the outcome over the 50 years, I would like to discuss some point that is, it's a recent, not actually recent case. A woman filed a writ petition regarding her rights of appointing as a marriage registration. It was a Bangladeshi woman named Aisha Siddiqa. In 2012, she applied for the post of marriage registrar, a position that was open for all. But she was called for an interview as well, but later her application was rejected only because she was a woman. Disappointed by the turn of events, Aisha, now 31st years old, filed a writ petition with the High Court in 2014, challenging the government's decision of not employing her because of her gender. In its full verdict, which was pronounced on February 26, 2020, the High Court upheld the Ministry of Law's 24 decision, saying women could not become Nika or marriage registered due to certain physical conditions and practical conditions of Bangladesh. So, although Article 28 talked about the non-discrimination against any citizen merely on the grounds of religion, caste, creed, sex, or place of birth. There are another example I should say very recently, a Bangladeshi women or Bangladeshi girl have appointed, have been supposed to to be appointed in Bangladesh Police, but due to his permanent address, the appointment is going to be cancelled. It's the news of last 2 days, but there is no specific remedy till now. That's why I am not discussing this very point. And in the point of reserved seat for the women, I mean the Article 65 of the Constitution, which has talked about the women should be represented, reserved seat for the women in National Assembly. Here I'm trying to show the data from 1973 to 2018 regarding the reserved women's seat and the general seat in the National Assembly. So from 1973, the reserved women's seat is getting increased, and till 2018 it has largely increased. So why it's a point of discussion, or why I am discussing this point. The point is, if women need to be represented in the National Assembly, it should be elected through a proper way of election, not by the selection. The process which we have been experiencing for 1973, women reserved seats, or the women have been selecting by the parliament. So if we think about the women representation, so it should be like the male representation in a way of election in a proper way, not the selection. So what's the negative impact of selection? They don't have any voting rights. They can represent her area, not elected and selected by the parliament. Okay, so in the next point, Article 9 ensures about women's representation in the development of local government institution as well. This is the example of one of the local government institution of Bangladesh. I would like to explain, that is Union Parishad. In Union Parishad, there are altogether there are 9 members, but for women there the three seats or 3 ward is reserved for the women is to 1 male. I mean 1 male and 3 women for 1 women for 3 reserved 3 wards. So if we think about the equal participation in the local government institutions, so it should be 50-50, I mean 5-5 or 4-4, but why 3:1? Okay. So these are the constitutional mechanism, and I try to mix up with the present scenario with the legal boundary under Constitution. So in the next point of my discussion, there are some other domestic legal mechanisms. There we have the Prevention of Women and Child Repression Act 2000 that has been recently amended, and we have Dowry Prohibition Act 2018, Domestic Violence Act 2010. Okay, so in the point of legal judicial protection, or the legal protection from domestic violence or other violence against women, section 26 of Nari o Shishu Nirjatan Daman Ain status about the establishment of tribunal in every district, and the number of tribunal may be increased in case of necessary. But the thing is that the lower criminal courts of Bangladesh are situated in the district level. So most of the cases, victims from rural areas are not willing to file a case due to the reachabilities of the judicial institution. And in the point of Domestic Violence Act, which has been enacted in 2010, there are some lackings in the point of definition, and particularly the law has not provided the proper definition of victims of household workers. But every day we are having the experience of victims of household workers who have been perpetrated from the household workers, their home and other situation. So these are the lackings in the point of Domestic Violence Act. So So what is the reality? If it is crystal clear that we have judicial protection, we have constitutional mechanism. So reality shows that we can stop rape in a running bus, we can stop killing in educational institute. Maybe the reason is that we are unable to provide legal education to our women, unable to provide human rights, we are unable to raise awareness among local people, we are unable to raise awareness between the bus drivers and even the whole society. So before concluding my presentation, I would like to quote from John Stuart Mill in his book, The Subjection of Women, the legal subordination of own sex to another was wrong and was one of the chief hindrances to human improvement and ought to be replaced by the principle of perfect equality. So in the standpoint of 15 years of independence, it's high time to implement our legislation, properly educate our women, properly educate our society. We need to making awareness among the society or the people regarding the women's rights. Women are not detached from the society. They are our part and they are also important part of life. Thank you all. Thank you very much for hearing me. If you have any question, comment, these are obviously welcome to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadika, for your presentation. I think there's a lot of room for discussion in terms of your conclusions that the gaps are really about education and awareness. And there could be questions about, is that all? And is that the only problem? Or are there more fundamental issues about power that we also have to address? Again, we'll wait for the discussions before we kick it off. But thank you very much for your comments. If you could just take the slides down now, Moni, that would be great. So I'm going to turn to our first discussant now, Dr. Faustina Pereira. As I said, for all of us here from Bangladesh, I don't think Faustina needs any introduction after possibly almost 3 decades of working at the interfaces of academia and practice in and outside the courts and very much in the community. As a result of this, her bio gives her a fantastic title, which is she's a gender and sustainable development specialist. And we definitely don't have very many of those. She's also one of those beleaguered people, a human rights activist and a scholar. And of course, a lawyer. She's currently the head of legal empowerment and sustainable development at the Center for Peace and Justice at BRAC University. And she's been a leading practitioner in the human rights world in Bangladesh and abroad. She's been she headed the advocacy program in Aino Shalish Kendro and research at BRAC's Human Rights and Legal Aid Services, at the International Development Law Organization in the Netherlands as well. She's also currently a professor of law and teaches international refugee law here at the University of Asia Pacific. And she also has a number of awards to her credit. I'm going to embarrass her a little bit by mentioning several of them. She was the Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum. Her book, The Fractured Scales, about one of the subjects we're discussing today, about the search for a uniform personal code. She received a gold medal for that. And she finished her doctorate at the University of Notre Dame. So it's a nice compliment today that we have Shadika from Notre Dame University in Bangladesh, the later, I suppose, child or later sibling, perhaps not necessarily child, of the Notre Dame University in America. So over to you, Tina.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that very kind introduction. I hope you all hear me well. Am I audible?
Yes, go right ahead. Very clear.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to all the organizers, and greetings to my co-panelists, presenters, and all those who have joined us in this webinar presentation as well. So I will limit my comments to Jaya Yadav's reading and analysis of Tahmima Anam's The Good Muslim and Akila Ismail's Of Marigolds and Martyrs. As you have gathered, these are 2 fictional novels looking at women's perspectives within and beyond the war experience. I should frame my comments on Joya's paper with the caveat that I'm neither a literary ethnographer nor am I a historiographer. My worldview is that of a feminist legal scholar, and this is what informs my understanding of this paper. What I have gathered upon reading of this paper is Jaya's attempt to establish a rather broad framework to locate, or I should say relocate, women and their sense of identity in these two fictional paradigms that she has chosen to analyze for us today. She attempts to grasp this relocating through law and legislation, although from my reading of it, I see that she has done it through a rather very light touch. And her focus keeps coming back to historiographical and literary insights. Nevertheless, where I believe the success of the analysis of this paper lies is in its underpinning of some essential and existential truths of how the flows and disruptions of nation building help to fashion women's own identities or the loss of it. So we get a glimpse of how, for example, in Tahmima Anam's protagonists, Rehana and Maya, and Aqila Ismail's Suri, how they yearn for the certitude and the certainty that citizenship brings, and how their lives have become symbolic of women being disillusioned with the project of nationalism in an independent Bangladesh. Overall, this is a very well put together paper. As all good papers, there is always room for further sharpening. And I feel that this paper holds that promise of developing into a much stronger and more insightful piece. And in that vein, I would like to make a few small recommendations, if I may, on how this paper could be further sharpened. Given that we are framing this discussion in the backdrop of a legal consciousness and the Constitution, I suggest that there is scope to take advantage of the rich post-independence judicial engagement in Bangladesh on issues of identity and marginalization vis-a-vis citizenship and of individual agency and mobility, particularly gendered mobility. Yes, judicial engagement, but at the same time, from a constitutional protection baseline, I would suggest that we can also see this engagement taking place at the executive and legislature as well. Although my remarks are primarily around the judicial engagement. My suggestion is one of the first points to sharpen the finer points of this paper is to look at the very Citizenship Act itself, and to look at how women's position has shifted from passive beneficiaries of the male line of transaction in the social contract of rights and privileges between the citizen and the state, and it has evolved to a position of recognizing women's domicile in her own right, where her own agency is now extended, where she transfers her rights accrued from her own legal personhood, which is not any longer or limited and constrained to only that which devolves from her grandfather or father or husband. In a way, this is the way the whole Citizenship Act and women's agency in it has been extended, is almost, I think it runs parallel to the nation building project itself. And to this, we can add layers of other dimensions of agency in other sites of contestation, whether we're talking about recognition of women as legal guardians of the children, beyond mere custodianship, to their ability to resist being pushed back into or being relocated into the conjugal home, to their protection in the public sphere, whether it is in holding, public office, whether at the local government, or I think Munir talked about parliament, or it's in sports, public transport, or the workplace. I think it's important to capture the moment at which we have arrived in this 50th year of our independence, where the rise of women's consciousness, legal consciousness, now carries with it the nation-building narrative, to the point where the indicators of national development revolve around women's participation in and mobility around development success stories of the nation. Of course, we still have a very long way to go in ensuring real and qualitative gendered empowerment. And I would recommend that this is where it's possible for the author to loop back to the fictionalized, semi-biographical, and ethnographic narrative to reflect on how perspectives and priorities around identities have shifted over time and space. The other area where I believe that, well, the paper
Sorry, you're breaking up a bit, Tina.
For saying that,
ma'am, your voice is lagging.
Struggles a little bit is in not perhaps fully marginalizing of women in opposition. So I would repeat. Can you hear me now? Am I audible?
Yes, you're fine now. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. No, I was going to suggest that another area that could be strengthened is to build further on claims around othering and marginalizing of women in opposition to men in war and post-war society. For example, statements like, quote, women from different communities were attacked by those who saw them as the enemy, unquote, I believe could benefit from clarifying and further contextualizing who was attacking whom, who is othering whom, and who is the enemy and in what context, and how enemy identity also shifts. Similarly, a Bengali speaker did not automatically mean to be Bengali. These ethnocentric definitions created the Geneva camp in Bangladesh, where Urdu speakers lived, hoping to move to Pakistan, but who were denied refuge there and continued to stay on in the camp as stateless citizens in a paradoxical web of citizenship without rights, unquote. I think these are important statements, but read without context, they can be a little overly broad and leave room for unhelpful interpretations. Bringing to light developments in a post-independent Bangladesh, for example, on constitutional protections for and for linguistic and ethnic minorities or others, which have been extended passports and paving the way for citizenship. Perhaps even the examination of the discourse around the 8th and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution around identity politics on religion, ethnicity, language, etc., could also prove useful. Another area I would suggest to look at is how women's gender identities had different formation narratives from others, particularly men. In both Anam's and Ismail's work, we see the deep impact of war on both women and men. In The Good Muslim, we particularly take notice of the disillusionment and trauma suffered by Suhail, who resorts to fanatical religiosity as an escape from his demons. Therefore, a clear outlining of the impact of war on, which is specific to women in all their intersectional dimensions and experiences, I think would be particularly beneficial. I will conclude here for now, but wish to reiterate that overall this is an excellent paper, Jaya, and I greatly enjoyed reading it. And I would, of course, be happy to continue to have a conversation with Jaya, the other co-panelists, and others in this session and beyond it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Faustina. We'll turn now to, and you've done a good job of finishing well within your time, so thank you particularly for that, and I hope you'll come back again when we have further questions and discussion. We'll turn now to Dr. Shahnaz Huda, who again needs little introduction to most of us from Bangladesh. Dr. Shahnaz Huda is former chairperson, I think, of Dhaka University Law Department, a professor there, and a specialist on women's rights issues. She's worked on the Child Marriage Restraint Act formulation and on assessments of the implementation of the Domestic Violence Act, amongst others. And she's published widely on the issue of women's rights, particularly in relation to family law, marriage registration, and many related issues. She's also active in the human rights movement in Bangladesh, and can be heard on a number of different issues, heard and read on a number of different issues. So Shahnaz, over to you, please, for your comments.
By asking the question which has become normal. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are audible and visible.
Can you just pull your screen towards you so we can see your face properly? A little bit more. You can just see your eyes and nose. A little bit more, please. Yeah, perfect. That's great. Go right ahead. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you to both our presenters. Thank you, Tina. And my discussion will be a bit prosaic compared to Tina and Jaya, because I'm not going to be talking about fiction. I'm going to be very much talking about the practical issues of law and the Constitution. I will be discussing mainly Munia's paper, which deals with feminism and the Constitution in Bangladesh, law, feminism, and Constitution in Bangladesh. And Munia has begun her paper by talking about Article 28 of the Constitution, about which I have something to say, because Article 28.2, which she has mentioned in her writing, talks about equal rights of men and women in the public life, in public and state life, leaving out a very important discourse of private, personal, family life, which is discriminatory, continues to be discriminatory, with little chance, it seems, with the extension of fundamentalist leanings of the whole country, where we see change. So I would like to talk about that, because many times I ask my students as to why, if we are talking about equal rights of men and women, why Muslim women will get half the property of a brother, why a Hindu woman in Bangladesh, unlike in India, will be deprived of property completely in the presence of a son. So the law, personal laws applicable to Muslims, Hindus, and even Christians to a certain extent, is discriminatory to the extent where the whole idea of talking about gender equality, and here I have to say that there is a little bit of difference in debate about whether we talk about feminism and gender equality from the same perspective, whether it means the same thing. So if we talk about personal laws, from the very beginning, the whole attitude of the Constitution, I feel, is more paternalistic, which we can see also in other lawmaking activities. For example, the labor law, which talks about women and adolescents not being allowed to do certain work, which talks about witnesses to marriage in a Muslim marriage, 2 women equal to 1 man. Women do not enjoy equal rights within the personal laws, and I think we have to actually stop avoiding discussing these, because although we talk about political empowerment and we talk about women working for equal rights, we have actually been avoiding, if I can say, the issue of personal rights, because it's just too contentious. And we need to start talking about that. And even other laws, for example, the Citizenship Act, which both Jaya and I think Faustina both mentioned, we still have, it took how many years from the independence to 1971 to 2009 before a woman, Bangladeshi woman, could transfer her citizenship to her children if she was married to a foreign man. So we still have those in the law books. We have still the idea that women will be entitled to bail if she's a woman, but others will not be entitled to bail. They will be treated differently as witnesses, as people who appear before court. All these issues are very important to discuss, even before we discuss about the Constitution. And I think there should be challenges relating to the discriminations which is inherent and which has an impact on everyday life of a woman. Without that, I don't think we can achieve equality at all. So some of the things that Monia discussed with, and I'd just like to go over them. For example, she talked about the laws related to violence against women. She talked about the Nari Shishu Nirjatan Dama 9, Women and Child Repression Prevention Act. The act itself, as you've seen in 2020, in a sort of knee-jerk movement, because of the many incidents of rape, the government included the death penalty. As if that is the solution of all the problems, where we know the access to justice for women. And I've recently had the chance of visiting some of the district courts, and the women unfriendly system, the entire process, like somebody has also mentioned in the chat box, for example, in the Evidence Act, in the rape cases which come before the tribunal and Nariya Shushini Jatandaman Tribunal, the whole idea that we are discussing the section 155(4) of the Evidence Act, which allows character reference of the victim. And we have been talking about changing it. The law minister has been, and we haven't been able to change that. Whereas within, I think, a week, we have included the death penalty for rape offenses. There are issues, for example, very practical issues, such as the prosecution service are at all not interested. They're corrupt. They are appointed based on political affiliations. So all these issues are very much relevant, and the Constitution, what is written are paper rights, which in reality, women do not have access to justice. Women are, once they come to court, they are faced with situations with, very practical problems. There's no space to sit. There are no restrooms for women. So the whole situation, and when we talk about the constitutional rights, actually, it becomes a non-issue when we talk to a woman who has really been a victim or a survivor of rape or any other violence. Munia has also talked about, I think I will be jumping from one thing to the other because I'm just going to be discussing what she has discussed. She has also talked about the Domestic Violence Act, and she has mentioned the fact that domestic workers are not included, but I think there's a very good reason, because the remedies that have been provided under the Domestic Violence Protection and Prevention Act are remedies which are civil in nature, protection orders and residence orders. So, and the violence committed against domestic workers are so acute in nature that these remedies would not actually suit them. Again, we see that the Domestic Violence Act has other problems. For example, if an order other than a protection order is violated, there is no punishment in the act. A woman who is divorced by her husband cannot actually access the magistrate's court under this act. So there are many problems that we have. We have, very practical problems. The DNA test has been, I think, been made mandatory, but we have DNA laboratories only in Dhaka, and from a village, a grassroots woman who has been raped. her, the tests have to be done in Dhaka. So all these practical issues have an impact on women's rights. Although the women's movement has been very successful, and they, as Munia rightly pointed out, has started much before 1971. But I think we need to sort of change our worldview a little bit and really talk about how women are accessing justice. We have, Sarah, please tell me if I'm running out of time.
Good, we'll tell you.
Okay, the judiciary has actually been quite proactive. For example, we've talked about reserved seats, and the case Shamima Sultana versus Bangladesh, where ward councillors who were elected in the reserved seats were not allowed to do work which basically did not earn them anything. So the courts have been quite proactive. Again, there was a case, I forget the name, I think it's Nasreen Akhtar versus Bangladesh, where the health directorate issued the position of health assistants, where they said whether they have to mention whether they're married or not. And if they're not married, they were not allowed to be considered for the job. And the court has, the Supreme Court has been very strict in saying that these are discriminatory acts. So we have an active judiciary, but again, many of the rules which are granted by the High Court have failed. For example, as BLAST, representatives of BLAST will very well know, and I've been thinking about this a lot, that there have been many public interest litigations related to gender rights, for example, the two-finger test, whether these are actually, why the highest court of the land is not making sure these rules are implemented, or whether the organizations which did manage to have, say, for example, directives as to how the police should behave with a rape victim, which these are not actually being practically being effective. So these are some of the issues that I think Munia can include in her writing, because we need to talk about the realities of a woman's life and not just what the law says. So I think I'll end here. I'll just say that as regards Jaya's paper, and I'm sorry, I can't really comment on that because I haven't been able to read through it. But the whole question about how the constitution sort of says the people of Bangladesh shall be known as Bangladesh, shall be known as Bangalis, which effectively leaves out a whole group of people from being considered, Bangladeshi, or people who don't speak the language are not to be considered as Bangladeshi. So I think if you're talking about the constitution, we need to also address those issues. And I think there was a question, and I would like to reply to that. Whether
don't reply to the question just yet. If you just wrap
okay.
up your comments, we'll come to those things.
I think I'm done as far as I can remember. Most of the things that and things like the judiciary have been active, but we need to actually ensure women's access to justice. And I think we can do many practical things with regard to such access. And along with talking about constitutional changes or how the constitution protects women's rights, we also need to look into the realities of women's existence in Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shahnaz. So I think, again, you're ending at a very relevant point, that we're trying to look not only at what is the normative structure, what are the laws that we have, how has the constitution been interpreted, but most importantly, how is it actually impacting on the lives of individuals and communities across the country. I think also Faustina has raised crucial questions which came out of Jaya's paper as well about identity, that 50 years on, we're not talking only about one community or one religion or one ethnicity or one language. We should have enough confidence, we do have enough confidence 50 years after our birth to talk about the multiplicity of identities, about intersections, and about gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, religion, disability, language, and most importantly, looking beyond citizenship as well, being more inclusive on those approaches. And I think we're very lucky in today's call, actually. We have a really incredible array of people here. Fantastic group of activists working on a host of different issues. We have Supreme Court lawyers who've worked on litigation on these issues. We have academics. So I think we're really, really lucky. So I'm going to force people to speak, even if they don't speak up themselves. But before we get to that, we already have a number of questions that have come to the speakers. So I'd like to perhaps put those first, and then we can open up after that. And we are now opening the discussion as well. So in addition to the questions you've already sent, please, if you want to speak, please follow the usual protocols, do the hand raise function, or write something in the chat, and I'll definitely call upon you. But in the first questions we have, there's a question from Sarah Batul about asking, and I think this is addressed to Shadika, to elaborate on the importance of women being able to represent their areas. And there's also a related question that is there a need for a reserved seat at all, considering the current context in Parliament? If we can start with Shadika, I'll go to the others as well on that afterwards.
In the first question, maybe was the importance of representing their areas. Actually, what's the main what is the objectives, or why we elect people, or why we elect local representatives? So to discuss about the societal right, but in the point of reserved seats, those who were selected by the Parliament, they can obviously represent their local areas where they are from, or parliaments or any other issues. But if reserved women, protection of women, or for the promoting the women rights, so there should be opportunity to talk about any issues regarding their particular areas or particular issues. So that particular in these I think the reserved women, or the elected women
problem, Shadik, I think there's a problem with your mic. Are you using a mic? Because there's a disturbance going on every time you speak.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yeah, this is better. Yeah, if you carry
on.
Okay.
So what I'm saying, that is, we elect the representatives to represent the society or particular area, to talk about the rights, to talk about the particular issues or situation. But in the point of selected, hello.
Go ahead, Shadika.
Okay. In the point of reserved women, or the selected women participant or selected Parliament members, they don't have voting rights. They can speak about particular issues, or they can represent their particular areas where they are from, or in any issues which brought before the society or the Parliament. So if the aim of the selection, these reserved women, is to protect women or promoting women rights, so there should be the option of talking about, to represent, to promote, or to protect. So from this point of view, I think the reserved women's seat, women should be represent their areas. They should be voting rights, and mainly they should be elected by the society or the voters. That's the thing.
Thanks, Shadika.
Maybe there was another question in 2021. Do we need is there need for a reserved seat considering the current context in Parliament? From my point of view, I think it can be to some extent, not for a large number, not for a more than 20 years, more than 15 years, not for the long period of time. As we have women speaker, we have women prime minister, we have lots of women member of Parliament, and we have the capability to being elected by the vote from the society or particular area. Thanks.
Thanks, Shadika. Would you like to respond on that, Jaya? Or do you want to skip that question? This is about representation, reservations, and do we need reservations?
I mean, I do get a sense of what Shadika is saying and what the question asked as well, where we're saying that women have the potential to be elected, although I do think it's important to point out so many countries in South Asia have had a woman prime minister, but that often isn't reflective of the realities of the rest of the women, you know, in the entire country. So that's always something to think about. Even India has 33% reservation in the rural Panchayati Raj, we don't have it in parliament, and how the bill has not been passed in all these years of, you know, India's independence either. So we don't even have that representation, although I do agree with Shadika that at least beginning on that representative front, that, okay, they can't vote, they can only, you know, talk about the issues, they don't actually have a say in that process, but at least that's a good beginning front politically, and I would say in terms of legality, for women to actually change the narrative about their own participation in politics.
Thank you. And back to the panelists, would either of you like to comment, Tina?
I think, Sarah, if I can sort of intercede here,
Sure.
I think the whole process of proportionate representation, I think that is the issue, that the women who are, especially in the parliament, the women who become the members of parliament are representing the parties, and they basically toe the party line, the majority party line. So, which is very strange considering at the union parishad and the lower levels, there is direct election. So I think that is something that has been debated and needs to be considered as to how these women do, you know, become members in the reserve seats. So the process itself, I think, maybe we still need affirmative action, but we need to rethink the process as to how they have become members of parliament.
Sarah, if I may simply add, we look, I think, in the case not only of women reserved seat, but for all forms of special temporary measures in the form of affirmative action, we look at not only the process, I think it's important to also look at the rationale, because the two important criteria here are temporary and special. And how long can some temporary go on, and how special is special that it goes on for you know, decade after decade. So it is, I think, a moment of national reckoning beyond only the process. So it's a going much deeper into the reckoning of the rationale for this.
Thank you, Tina. There's another question here and a comment from Advocate Rizal Karim Siddiqui. I'm just going to ask if we can unmute Rizal Karim Siddiqui. Sorry, somebody else's mic is now unmuted.
Mahbub, can you please unmute Mr. Karim?
I think he's unmuted. Advocate Rizal Karim Siddiqui, who's a Supreme Court lawyer and also a writer and activist on disability rights. Reza, please, Bolin.
Thank you so much, Apa. If you allow, I would like to speak in Bengali.
Of course, we've got the question already, so please go ahead.
Okay. আবার ধন্যবাদ আপা। আমি আসলে যে কোশ্চেনটা ওখানে লিভ করেছিলাম সেটার বাইরে অন্য একটা বিষয় একটু বলতে চেয়েছিলাম, তো আপনি অনুমতি দিলে সেটা বলবো নাকি যেটা আমি কোশ্চেন করেছি?
আপনার কোশ্চেনটা যদি আগে রাখতে পারেন খুব ভালো হয়।
আচ্ছা, আমার কোশ্চেনটা ছিল যে আমাদের যে ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্ট বাংলাদেশে, সেটা তো মানে খুবই একটা মানে চ্যালেঞ্জিং বিষয়, কারণ হচ্ছে যে আমাদের যে মানে কালচার এবং আমাদের যে আইন কানুন যেগুলো হয়েছে, এগুলো মানে কোনোটাই আমাদের অনুকূলে নেই, কালচারও অনুকূলে নেই, এবং আইন যেগুলো হয়েছে দেখতে ভালো লাগে আইনগুলো, কিন্তু আসলে এগুলো আমাদের মানে খুব একটা কাজের না। আইনগুলোকে আমরা জাস্ট ল হিসেবেও মানে উইমেন রাইটস প্রোটেকশনের দিক থেকে আর কি এগুলোকে অনেক ক্ষেত্রে আমরা জাস্ট ল বলতে পারি না, আবার যেগুলো জাস্ট ল সেগুলো আবার আমাদের যে রুল অফ লটা না থাকবার কারণে কিন্তু আমরা আসলে সেই লগুলোকে কাজেও লাগাতে পারছি না। সব মিলিয়ে একটা মানে আমাদের মানে এই জায়গাটা আমি একটু বলছিলাম। আর ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্টের ভেতরেও আমার কাছে মনে হয়েছে কিছুটা চ্যালেঞ্জ হয়তো বা রয়েছে, কারণ ওই স্ট্রাকচারের মধ্যে আমরা আন্ডার রিপ্রেজেন্টেড উইমেন্স গ্রুপ কিংবা এক্সক্লুডেড উইমেন্স গ্রুপকে কিন্তু একটু কম দেখতে পাই। একটা উদাহরণ যদি দেই, যেমন 50টা রিজার্ভ সিট পার্লামেন্টে আছে, আপাতত দৃষ্টিতে এই রিজার্ভ সিটকে আমরা ওয়েলকাম করি, যদিও মানে পদ্ধতিটা ভালো না, কিন্তু এই যতটুকু এটা ইতিবাচক ভাবে দেখি, সেখানেও দেখবেন যে এই 50টা সিটের মধ্যে কিন্তু অদ্যাবধি এখন পর্যন্ত কোনো উইমেন উইথ ডিসেবিলিটিস কিন্তু আসেননি। এবং আমার মনে হয় না যে উইমেন ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্ট থেকেও কখনো খুব জোরে সোরে এই বিষয়টা দাবি জানানো হয়েছে যে অন্তত 2টো সিট তাদেরকে দেওয়া হোক। এখন এটা পলিটিক্যাল পার্টির ব্যাপার হতে পারে, কিন্তু পলিটিক্যাল পার্টির সাথেও তো অ্যাডভোকেসির ক্ষেত্রে ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্টের একটু জোরে আওয়াজ দেওয়া উচিত বলে মনে করি। তো এই জায়গাটা আমি রেজ করেছিলাম টেক্সটে। আর সর্বশেষ মানে 1 মিনিটে আমি একটা বিষয় শুধু বলবো আবার, যে আমাদের বাংলাদেশে এই রাইট নাও দুইটা ভয়ঙ্কর রকমের প্রপাগান্ডা কনসাসলি এবং আনকনসাসলি কিন্তু ইনক্লুডিং ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্টে যারা জড়িত আছেন তারাও এন্ডোর্স করে যাচ্ছেন। একটা হচ্ছে যে বলা হচ্ছে 90 থেকে 95% ডিভোর্স নাকি নারীরা দিচ্ছেন এবং নারীরা ডিভোর্স এর প্রতি ঝুঁকে পড়ছেন। এই যে একটা ভুল ব্যাখ্যা, ভুল মানে কথা, এটাকে কিন্তু আমরা কেউ কাউন্টার করছি না ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্ট থেকে। উল্টো যুক্তি দেওয়া হচ্ছে যে উইমেনরা এখন সচেতন হয়েছে তাই তারা ডিভোর্স দিচ্ছে। বিষয়টা কিন্তু আসলে তা না। বিষয়টা হচ্ছে আমাদের পলিগ্যামি অ্যালাউড এবং পলিএন্ড্রি প্রহিবিটেড, এবং হচ্ছে রেজিস্ট্রেশনটা হচ্ছে ছেলেরা ডিভোর্স দিলেও সেই ডিভোর্স রেজিস্ট্রেশন করে না, ফলে সেটা ডেটাতে আসে না। কিন্তু নারীদের ক্ষেত্রে যেহেতু ডিভোর্স রেজিস্ট্রেশন না করে আরেকটা বিয়ে করাটা বেআইনি হয়ে যায়, তাই জন্য তারা কিন্তু লফুলি সেটাকে রেজিস্ট্রেশন করে। এখন নিয়ম মেনে তারা ডিভোর্সটা রেজিস্ট্রেশন করছে বিধায় তাদের সংখ্যাটা ডেটাতে বেশি আসছে, কিন্তু আনডকুমেন্টেড যে পুরুষদের দিক থেকে যে ডিভোর্স, সেগুলার যে মানে 95% যে রেজিস্ট্রেশন হচ্ছে না, সেই কথা কিন্তু কেউ বলছে না। উল্টো শুধু বলে যাচ্ছে যে 95% নারী নাকি ডিভোর্স দিচ্ছে। এই বাজে একটা মানে প্রপাগান্ডা চলছে, এটাকে করছেন না। এটা আমার একটা প্রশ্ন ছিল।
অনেক ধন্যবাদ। Many thanks, Reza. I've translated Reza's comments and important points in the chat, so please have a look at that. I'm going to come now to Dr. Bina Da Costa, who's here with us, a professor at Australian National University, and I think I should also say a Bangladeshi and international human rights activist and feminist, of course. Bina.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to both of the presenters and the panelists for very interesting papers and the observations. So Jaya and Shadhika, I also had the opportunity to read both of your drafts. So I'll just maybe limit my comments to some of the ways perhaps you can take those forward and revise those. So one thing I see is that both papers, you immediately delve onto the subject matter before really going to the methodological important points. So the first is the so what question, that why do we need to delve into this subject matter? How is it connected to what are the conversations, for example, we are having today? So I think that's very important. And here I have separate points. So Jaya, for your paper, you talked about this othering. So the other, and here we have so much work already coming out of South Asia and also elsewhere. Obviously, the Kolkata Bhadralok group, the subaltern literature is very much there. And here, in terms of that kind of narrative, Mahashweta Devi's work has been analyzed a lot, and I'm sure you know that. So maybe linking that to the stories of this whole nation building and state building, because it tells us that within the South Asian feminist movements and women's movements, because you are drawing from literature, that's why I'm telling you this, that how there are also different kinds of ways memory have been seeped into your understanding of identity politics, how national myths have been produced, our anthem, our flag, our movements, women bearing arms, all of these, how we actually write about those. And you talk about fiction, and I want to also request you at least to footnote some of the military memoirs, because those were the first accounts of the war in 1971. So the first one was written by Siddiq Salik, Witness to Surrender. And after that, 3 different Pakistani generals, for example, Raja and others, they talked about, they also talked about the war. And in these memoirs, and you can totally juxtapose that with Anam's framing, the racialization and gender processes, how those were described, how Bengalis were always understood as weak, feminized, impoverished, and they all needed to be saved. So this saving kind of discussion. And all of these narratives talked about, primarily focused on the war of India and Pakistan, but basically delegitimized Mukti Bahini, right? In comparison, when you see recently Anisur Rahman's Ma, for example, came out, it valorized Mukti Jodha Azad, I think her son, and talked about motherhood and humanity and how actually that is seeped into Bangladesh's nation building narrative. So, and then obviously you have the stories and narrative that talk about women's participation. So I think that framing is very, very important to look at how within the society we talk about nation building and these organic processes. And in my work, I completely separated this from state building, where I see law and governance operate in a very specific way. So that's my comment to you, Jaya, and I'm happy to talk about it separately. Shadika, thank you for your paper. Your presentation was interesting, and your paper was slightly different, I thought, because there's a paradox, if you like, because you begin by saying that feminism is not an organic concept, it comes from elsewhere. And I would like to push you a little bit to think about it a bit more. That is it really? The women's rights movements within South Asia and then in the subcontinent, it's so deep and so, meaning it's been connected to obviously anti-colonial movements and national movements. But even before that, issues of land rights, issues of, in different regions, how in different times women have participated in movements. So I think maybe here you can reconceptualize that what we mean by feminism, or maybe feminisms. And then there are women's rights activists, defenders, who may not necessarily mention that they're feminists, but they work in very different ways promoting rights. So I think you need to really frame that, because I would question you seriously about it methodologically. Second point is that you say it's very new, but again, going to British India and the history there, and in 1930s, and then even in 1936, I think, that election as well, so many women won the seat. So some of those are really important to bring into your conversation when you talk about Bangladesh. I have another point, but I think I got a bit distracted with somebody's microphone on. But I can come back to this. So for you, Shadika, my point mainly is semantics and those linguistic variances. The lawyers with us, they've explained very well about the legal space and how you talk about that. And here, may I just quickly ask you also to reread, if you haven't yet, Faustina Pereira's Fractured Scales and also Sarah's edited volume on honor, because both would give you really nice hooks and to think about some of those kinds of methodological framing that you need to have this legal analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Bina. And I think that's a good reminder for us that we are fortunate in this session that we've heard from two speakers, two presenters who are working on their papers. Today's conversation, I think, will give insights and I think give also valuable inputs for them as they go forward with their writing, and I think help all of us with what they finally produce in terms of increasing our own learning and understanding. So we have a few more questions. I think I can see two hands up, so I'm sorry, just before you, I've got an earlier question from Atif Chaudhry, and I wonder if you could give him the mic. Would that be possible, please?
I think I can unmute myself. Can you guys hear
great,
me?
you can now. Yeah, I think it's possible now. Please go ahead, Atif, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. This has been a great discussion. I was just wondering, how have courts in Bangladesh generally upheld gender rights issues within the workplace? And are there particular issues in the workplace that disproportionately impact women and maybe trans workers?
Thanks, Atif. So can I go to the panelists on that one first? Tina, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Atif, for that question. You're probably aware that we have directions, or rather outlined from the High Court Division on women's rights in the workplace, particularly around sexual harassment. And these are guidelines which are supposed to be implemented in all organizations, but particularly in the public sphere. Unfortunately, we do not see that happening. There are, of course, some good examples of a number of organizations and institutions where sexual harassment redressal committees have been set up and are doing exemplary work and have taken forward the understanding of the various dimensions of a workplace protection for all genders, going beyond the binary of male and female, and also bringing in the other understandings of gender and sexuality and orientation, including the rights of transgender communities. However, the protection of transgendered communities in the public sphere is still in its early stages in terms of discussion and discourse. The Gazette notification 8 years ago, which recognized, quote unquote, the third gender, is still very far from being fully understood in a uniform manner as to what it is, what it ought to be, and how the protections for this segment of the population needs to look like. This is very much a work in progress, but in fact, overall sexual harassment and protection in the workplace is a work in progress, and there's much more room for progress on that one.
Thanks, Tina. Does anyone else want to respond?
Yes, I just wanted to say that, there is we have a Labor Act, and there are certain specific provisions which deal with issues relating to women, mainly health, and within the factories, certain rights that they're given. But there's also a section which deals with harassment within the factory. But unfortunately, the Labor Act only deals with formal labor. So we have a vast, huge number of women who are in the informal labor sector, for example, domestic workers, who are not covered by these acts. So if there is, and we have labor courts and labor appellate tribunal, but it's a very interesting question. I'm sure somebody who has been involved in the labor movement, women's labor, especially in the ready-made garment sector, can answer. But we do have a big issue with the fact that a huge number of women are not covered by these legislation. They will have to actually access the penal laws, the penal code of Bangladesh. And as far as transgender, as Faustina was mentioning, we have, I think just recently have a transgender person becoming an Union Parishad chairman or a member. But questions such as inheritance rights of a transgender person, those have not been dealt with. So we are very much talking about, still at the stage of talking about those.
Thanks, Shana. So I think the question was focusing particularly on rights in the workplace. So Jaya, you wanted to answer that as well?
Yeah, sure. I think there are several acts in place to protect women in the workplace, but I think the question which we need to ask even before that is, how many women can even access those or feel comfortable in filing a complaint and knowing that their complaint is going to be heard, or there's going to be a more of an objective committee surrounding the issues that they've brought to light. And I think Professor Huda also mentioned that so many times you have to see the reality of the conditions of women. Like we're talking about these courts that don't even have washrooms for women, or there's no place to sit. And when we talk about these issues in the workplace, we're also often looking at urban upper middle class workplaces. So it's also important to remember when you look at employed women, a lot of them are in the unorganized sector. And it's probably easier for women in more formal places or women who are higher up in that social hierarchy to file a complaint or even know that they can file these complaints.
Thanks. Monia. Sorry, I'm muted. Monia, did you want to respond on that? Then I'm going to take a whole bunch of new comments. No? I think Monia may have a connection problem at the moment. Okay, we have a whole bunch of new questions and comments. So I'm going to suggest to the panelists and the presenters, if you please follow what you hear, I'm going to come back to you at one go at the end. I'm going to turn now to Shihab. Shihab, you can unmute yourself, please.
Yes.
Hello.
This is Shihab. I'm a Chief Executive of Bangladesh Intersex Forum. Would you please open my video because it is stopped by the yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? And
yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, fine. So actually, I do not talk frequently in English. That's why I'm talking in Bengali. So আমি আসলে একদম ভূমিকা না করে সরাসরি একটা কথা বলতে চাই সেটা হচ্ছে যে একটা ইন্টারসেক্স ইস্যু নিয়ে আমি কথা বলতে চাই। সেটা হচ্ছে যে এখানে যারা আছেন তারা হয়তো বা অনেকেই জানেন না যে ইন্টারসেক্স বিষয়টা কি, বা হচ্ছে যে অনেকেই জানেন বা বিস্তরভাবে জানেন। আমি তাদের জন্য বলছি ইন্টারসেক্স কন্ডিশনটা হচ্ছে এমন যাদের জন্মের সময় যাদের যৌনাঙ্গ দেখে বোঝা যায় না যে তারা ছেলে অথবা মেয়ে। এই যে এই ছেলে মেয়ের বাইরে যে যৌনাঙ্গ রয়েছে তা সেই মানুষদেরকে আমরা ইন্টারসেক্স হিসেবে আইডেন্টিফাই করব। তো হচ্ছে যে যখন তারা বুঝতে পারে না যে তারা ছেলে অথবা মেয়ে, তখন থেকেই তাদের হচ্ছে যে একটা ডিসক্রিমিনেশন শুরু হয় ছোটবেলা থেকে, এবং ডক্টরের কাছে নিয়ে যাওয়া হয় আমাদের সোশ্যাল যে নরমেটিভ ওয়ে আছে ছেলে অথবা মেয়েতে কনভার্ট করার জন্য। তো এই জিনিসটা আগে বর্তমানে আগে হচ্ছে যে খুবই প্রাইভেসি মেনটেন করে বা হচ্ছে করা হয়, কিন্তু সাম্প্রতিক সময় আমাদের BSMMU বঙ্গবন্ধু শেখ মুজিবুর মেডিকেল ইউনিভার্সিটিতে একটা ডিপার্টমেন্ট খোলা হয়েছে। সেখানে বলা হয়েছে ডিসঅর্ডার অফ সেক্স ডেভেলপমেন্ট, আর ডাক্তারি ভাষায় আমাদের মতো মানুষদেরকে বলা হয় DSD পেশেন্ট। ঠিক আছে, তো হচ্ছে সেই জায়গা থেকে হচ্ছে যে তারা চাচ্ছে যে এই যে ইন্টারসেক্স মানুষগুলোকে আছে তাদেরকে বিভিন্ন যৌনাঙ্গের বিভিন্ন অংশ কেটে বা হচ্ছে বিভিন্ন অংশ রিমুভ করে তাদেরকে ছেলে অথবা মেয়েতে রূপান্তরিত করার জন্য। এবং হচ্ছে যে যেটা দেখা হচ্ছে যে আজকে একটা ভিডিও প্রকাশ করা হয়েছে যেখানে অনেক 1 বছরের বা 2 বছরের বাচ্চারা আসছে, তাদেরকে হচ্ছে তাদের হচ্ছে যৌনাঙ্গের মানে গঠন পরিবর্তন করার জন্য বা ছেলে বা মেয়েতে রূপান্তরিত করার জন্য নিয়ে আসা হয়েছে। এখন আমার কথা হচ্ছে যে তারা রূপান্তরিত করতে পারবে, কিন্তু আমার কথাটা হচ্ছে যে আফটার 18 ইয়ার্স পরে বা হচ্ছে এরকমই, কারণ 1 বছরের বাচ্চার পক্ষে তার জেন্ডার আইডেন্টিটি কি, তার সেক্সুয়ালিটি কি, বা তার হচ্ছে এই যে বিষয়গুলো, এটা মানে পুরোপুরি ভাবে আসলে সে আসলে ডিসাইড করতে পারে না। পারিবারিক ভাবে আমি যদি আমার এক্সাম্পল দিই, আমি হচ্ছে আমার 12 বছর বয়সে হচ্ছে আমার শরীর থেকে ইউটেরাস এবং ওভারি কেটে ফেলা, আমার ফ্যামিলি চয়েস। কিন্তু আমি অনেক আগে থেকেই একটা নিজেকে একজন মেয়ে মনে করি, কিন্তু আমার জন্ম থেকে আমার যৌনাঙ্গ দেখে যখন বুঝতে পারে না আমার বাবা মা যে আমি ছেলে অথবা মেয়ে এরকম কিছু, বাট তারা আমাকে একটা ছেলের মতো রাইজ করেছে। আমার যৌনাঙ্গ আমার শরীর থেকে ইউটেরাস ওভারি কেটে ফেলছে এবং আমাকে দীর্ঘদিন ধরে টেস্টোস্টেরন হরমোন থেরাপি দেওয়া হয়েছে, যেটা আমার মেন্টাল হেলথের জন্য মানে বাজে রকম। আমি অনেক সুইসাইডাল ছিলাম, হ্যাঁ, আমি সেই জায়গা থেকে রিমুভ করে আসছি। আমি একটা কথা বলি, আমি দুইটা বিষয় মেনশন করতে চাই। প্রত্যেকটা জায়গায় আমি হচ্ছে হ্যারাসমেন্টের শিকার হই। আমি বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে গেলে বা
আপনাকে সরি আমি একটু ইন্টারাপ্ট করছি এই কারণেই যে আপনার ইস্যুটা খুবই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ এবং আপনি যেটা রেজ করেছেন, কিন্তু আমরা চেষ্টা করছি আজকে আমরা যে দুটো বক্তব্য শুনেছি সেটার সাথে সম্পৃক্ত করে কথাগুলো বলতে। তো আপনি যদি ওনাদের কাছে কোনো প্রশ্ন রাখতে চান, আমার মনে হয় আপনি যে বিষয়টা তুলেছেন যে আসলে জেন্ডারের সংজ্ঞাটা কি এবং আমরা এখানে বৈচিত্র্যতাকে স্বীকার করছি কি করছি না, নাকি আরো সমস্যা এবং নির্যাতনের মধ্যে ফেলে দিচ্ছি, এই প্রশ্নটা ওনাদের কাছে
আমি খুব স্পেসিফিক করে বলতে চাই, সেটা হচ্ছে
আপনি
যে
ওনাদের কাছে যদি প্রশ্নটা রাখেন,
হ্যাঁ, প্রশ্ন করে রাখছি। সেটা হচ্ছে যে আপা আমার কাছে যেটা কোশ্চেন সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমরা যারা হচ্ছে যে এই যে ইন্টারসেক্স কমিউনিটি রয়েছে বা ডাইভার্স কমিউনিটির মধ্যে যারা রয়েছি, তো হচ্ছে যে আমরা এই যে নারী আন্দোলন বা ওমেন আন্দোলন বা হচ্ছে আপনি যদি বলেন ফেমিনিজমের জায়গা থেকে বলেন, তা আমাদের যে পয়েন্ট অফ ভিউ, আমাদের কিন্তু হচ্ছে আমাদের যে ওমেন যারা রয়েছে তাদের রাইট নিয়ে কিন্তু আসলে এই যে যারা মেইন স্ট্রিমে ওমেন মানে ফেমিনিজম নিয়ে কাজ করছেন তারা কিন্তু সেন্সিটাইজ না।
ঠিক আছে,
এই বিষয়টা হচ্ছে তারা কিভাবে দেখছেন।
অবশ্যই, অনেক ধন্যবাদ, তাহলে এটা অবশ্যই রেজ করছি। থ্যাংক ইউ শিহাব। এবার সরি, let me turn to Nadima Khan. এবার Nadima Khan, if you can raise your question. Sorry,
Sarapa, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. My question is sort of similar to the earlier question. So my question is that intersex people, those who consider themselves as women, I consider them as women as well. But unfortunately, our society doesn't yet. In fact, even the laws don't. In short, I'll just mention rape law. According to the definition of rape, only a woman can be raped. So a trans woman cannot be raped. So what can we do to make them feel more included in the society, as well as what steps can we take to amend this law so that they feel included as well? Thank you, Sarapa, and everyone.
Thank you so much, Nadima. So I hope the our speakers are getting those points. I'm going to turn now to Muhammad Amir Al-Haqq, who is again an advocate of the Supreme Court, the very experienced practitioner on family matters. Particularly, I know him very much as the great expert on custody law. Tuhin.
Thank you, Abba. Thank you.
Your connection is a bit bad, Tuhin. I wonder if you should turn your video off, or if you have a mic or something, because there's a.
Do we hear me now?
It's very bad connection. Yeah, just if you're using a mic, maybe stop using that and just speak directly.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but there's a lot of interference. Go ahead, let's try.
Sorry, maybe I missed some of the discussions of the presenters, and that's why I could not find out whether the issues of Divorce Act 1869 was discussed in this presentation. I think this law should be amended because this law is not only applicable for Christian communities in Bangladesh. This law is applicable for the persons who do not belong to any religion or inter-religion marriages. And I met many of my clients, and there is, in fact, no scope of dissolving a marriage under this act without blaming either the husband or the wife with some allegations which are not suitable at this era or for this present world, and for this reason this law should be immediately amended. I have also an observation on the Guardians and Words Act. Do you hear me?
Yes, but you're sounding like somebody out of a Star Wars film because it's very unclear. But yeah, carry on.
According to the Guardians and Words Act in Bangladesh, no female can, in effect, no female can pray for guardianship of their children. In the text of the law, some words are still prevailing, which cannot exist in independent Bangladesh. In the law, it was stated that except the European British subjects, no person can be appointed as guardian whose father is living and is not, in the opinion of the court, unfit to remain as guardian. I met many clients who are Bangladeshi, not at all European British subject, but they cannot pray for guardianship of their children, though their husband do not have any responsibility in raising up their child. So this provision should also be amended. And another observation on Domestic Violence Act, I heard Shanazita Madam told tell about something on this act, but I found that this law is not yet popular in Bangladesh, though it was enacted in 2010, and according to my consideration, this is a great achievement for feminist activists in Bangladesh, though the law is yet to give remedy to many victims of domestic violence of Bangladesh. So we should do something to make remedies available under these acts familiar among our litigants or justice seekers. This is all my observations. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuhin. I hope people were able to follow. I'll raise it again I've sent it all to the panelists. Please have a look at your chat and your WhatsApp. Can I just ask Nina, Advocate Nina Goswami, who's here from Ain Shalish Kendru, who also had a question for the panelists.
Yes, Sarah. I have a question to Sadika. In her concluding slides, she told that one thing, that the proper education for women is needed. What is the meaning of proper education?
Thanks, Nina. Good question.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Shadika, we just hold on for a second because there are a couple more questions. We'll take all of them and I'll come to each of you. There's one more question from Priya Asan.
Yeah. Yes, so I wanted to ask a general question on disability laws. So I wanted to say, apart from discussing the issues on laws and constitutional rights not being upheld for disabled persons, should we not also reevaluate what constitutes disability? Because our laws seem to very conveniently exclude all the different forms of disabilities, which are now recognized all over the world. Including different kinds of mental health issues, which are obviously not very visible disabilities. Also, should we not start considering short-term disabilities for an uncountable woman suffering from severe prolonged menorrhagia? I wanted to particularly mention this since such recognition actually may help young women and girls in universities or even at work excel more than they otherwise can. Also, if we don't really recognize these, I mean, how can we expect equity in this society?
Thanks so much, Priya. Okay, I think we have just enough time now to go back to the panelists. So I'm going to ask, I'm just going to put the questions to you. I'm not going to give every question to everybody. So some of the questions that we have that you haven't all seen include from Kate Tanha, who is, I believe, in Cambridge, a question about sexual orientation laws in Bangladesh. What are the legal opportunities and challenges in recognizing and ensuring the rights of same-sex couples in Bangladesh? Priya's question you just heard, and there's an unanswered question still from Advocate Rizal Karim Siddiqui about unregistered marriages and divorces and any recourse in this situation. And again, a similar question to Priya's about inclusion of disability and diversity of disability. And I think, so let me go on that unregistered marriages question. Perhaps let me go to Shahnaz Huda on that.
Yeah, unregistered marriages are perfectly valid. Unregistered marriages, it's the case where if your marriage is not registered, the parties are punishable, but the marriage itself is valid. For example, the Hindu Marriage Registration Act specifically mentions in the act that it's just an optional law. When it comes to court, then if it's a registration of marriage is considered to be the best proof of marriage, but if the marriage is not registered, it doesn't mean that the courts will not recognize the marriage, but they will have to take recourse to very convoluted methods of proving the marriage. So in that case, witnesses and people, especially, for example, in the case of Hindu law, just in 2012, the Hindu Marriage Registration Act was enacted. And before that, people had to produce wedding pictures and things like that to prove a marriage. So I hope I've been able to answer that question. So unregistered marriages are still considered to be valid, but when it comes to court, it needs to be proved through extensive, maybe complicated evidence.
And the question on sexual orientation, can I give that to Tina, please? Yes, Tina.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. In terms of recognition of sexual orientation, I would, maybe others can clarify, but my understanding is that a real meaningful discourse is yet to begin in the country. However, the step that needs to be taken prior to that, in my view, is around Section 377 of the Penal Code. And there is quite a lot of progress on this in our neighboring countries, particularly in India, in the decriminalizing of the rights of the LGBTQ community. And there's some conversation, but I would say in very limited pockets. And this really, we have a very long and far way journey on this one in Bangladesh. Sarah, since I have the microphone, can I go very quickly to Amirul's question about the 1869 Divorce Act? Amirul, I am happy to inform you and others that at last some progress is taking place on not just the Divorce Act, but also the 1872 Marriage Act, which of course mainly governs the Christian community, but as you have pointed out, in case of divorce, particularly under the, say, civil law of marriage, those divorces also come under the 1869 law. The Law Commission is working closely with a national committee and primarily made up of members of the Christian community, at long last with the recognition and acknowledgement of the Christian recognized churches, and therefore some progress is being made in terms of redrafting these laws. But it's a good thing that you mentioned about the non-Christian communities, and in our zeal to reform these laws, we should not forget about others who would also be affected. I am taking note of that. Thank you for raising it.
Can I just come in and mention something? Faustina is very right that the Law Commission has been working on the Divorce Act, but whether the government is actually listening to the Law Commission is a question. And also the Law Commission, to their credit, has also tried to work on the Special Marriage Act to make it much more, religion friendly, in the sense that two people can get married without, not religion friendly. I mean, two people can get married without recourse to mentioning any religion. Something along the lines of the Special Marriage Act of 1954 in India. So, and as regards same-sex, I just wanted to make a point that I think somebody raised the issue about the very the scope of the definition of rape, which does not include males. And in fact, the courts have actually been using Section 377 to go, to deal with cases of rape of male children and so forth. So, instead of talking about getting rid of the section, they have been actually reduced to using this section to, sort of charge people when it's a question of rape against a male person. I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks, Shehnaz. I just want to now just go to the two presenters to answer the remaining questions before we go into our closing. Munia, did you want to answer the questions that were there?
Yeah,
the remaining
that was
questions?
regarding proper education.
Yes, what did you mean by that? Yeah. You can't be heard, Munia.
Okay, sorry.
Still can't be heard.
Hello.
Yeah, now you're fine.
So what's the meaning of education or proper education? What was the difference actually? Actually, education is an quality or...
Sorry, your mic's gone again, Munia. I think just while we're fixing that, let me turn. Yeah, can try again.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
So proper in of my presentation or in the point of my view, I'd like to explain the proper education meaning about the gender studies, about sexual education, proper participation in the family planning. Our women are educating. They have earning graduation degree. They have been earning lots of degrees, but in the point of family life, they are not participating in family planning most of the cases. Even in our education system till secondary education, we don't have specific chapters or part of legal education. So in part of our education system or our study materials, legal education, gender education should be included. So not only the aim of the education is to provide degrees, preparing for the jobs, it's also eradicate the eradicate the darkness of mind, darkness of the society. So most of the cases we faces that women are enemying other women, are doing something bad for the another women. So I think it's the lacking of proper education. They can't participate in society building, nation building. So in this point, proper education is important.
Thank you, Munia. And the last respondent to Jaya.
Yeah, I'll just take on the question that somebody had asked first about disability and mental health and how we should be increasing, our definition of what constitutes as disability, especially in the 21st century. People have said it's not as if these issues or disorders, they didn't exist before, but we finally have the vocabulary to describe and recognize things like depression or anxiety, which are truly disabilities, but they're not always classified as disabilities by the court or by the constitution, which would thereby grant somebody affirmative action or reservation in their respective country, because I think even Bangladesh and even India both have certain reservations in schools or colleges for students with disabilities. So I do think definitely that we do need to widen the scope of this definition, that all disabilities are not physical and they aren't necessarily visible to everyday people. So definitely. And just coming to the other question that was asked on identity and representation and the lack of reform of personal laws, including custody and divorce that Advocate Tuhin talked about, I think just taking it back to how we see in at least the Good Muslim and the Golden Age in Bangladesh before 1971, that women, if there was a woman who was widowed, or if she could not prove to the court that she had certain funds, her children would be taken away from her. And of course, this has changed over time in terms of who gets to be a citizen coming from a mother in Bangladesh, or who gets to inherit property as well, even though there might not be 100% division of the property between gendered children. in Bangladesh and even in India. At least there are recourses and discussions happening on that, because, you know, in the novel, Rihanna has to over time buy a house, procure money, even though she's now a single mother who doesn't have access to her children, and they are very far away. So she builds this massive house in Dhanmandi, gives it on rent, goes back to the court, you know, falls all those bureaucratic hurdles of proving she has these tenants who can pay her money, and therefore she is quote unquote eligible to reclaim her motherhood. So I think we also have to remember how much materiality and money play a role in securing legal advice or legal acquisition of your rights, which could have been your human rights in the first place, and then they translate into property rights or gendered rights or even disability rights.
I just want to make one comment that's come from Rizal Karim Siddiqui, saying his question was about registration of divorce and the problems about polygamy. Because polygamy is legal, male partners don't register divorce. And that's why the number of divorces by husbands is lower than the actual number, whereas women have to register divorce before they remarry. And that's why the City Corporation information shows that 95% of divorces are being executed by women. So he wanted some input on that, because he feels that creates an additional stigma on women, this assumption that more women are divorcing. Can I give you 1 minute on that, Shahnaz, because we're now going towards our closing.
Well, I don't think women have to register the divorce. Neither party has to, because divorce registration on the Muslim Marriages and Divorces Registration Act are optional for both the parties. But if a woman wants to remarry, she may have to show documents saying she's divorced. But in the case of a man and in the case of polygamy, he will only not register his, I'm not sure I got the question right, but his marriage, second marriage will not be registered if he has not taken the permission of the Arbitration Council for his polygamous marriage. So, I mean, it's not necessary that if he enters into a polygamous marriage, his second marriage will not be registered. But if a man gets into polygamous marriage without the requisite permissions, he may not register his second marriage. I don't know whether I got the question right.
I think we have stuff for a different debate and a deeper conversation on this elsewhere. I was hoping to offer you each 1 minute of conclusion, but I'm afraid I don't think we have that time anymore. And we're going to go towards, we're 5 minutes away from closing. So I want to just end by thanking all of the speakers, of course, the presenters and the discussants, and all of those who raised their questions, all of you who've been here and listened patiently. I think, there are some big takeaways from this. We heard 2 papers, one a reflection on 2 novels and representations on Tamima Anam's novel, and another one of Marigold's, but representations of women in situations of conflict and what that kind of tells us about the understanding of gender equality. And we heard from Jaya Yadav, and we heard another presentation from Shadika Hakmonia, looking at the Bangladeshi legal framework and the extent to which it does or doesn't conform to constitutional standards on gender equality, and also a perspective around the role of the women's movement and feminists in particular. I think some of our takeaways from this are that the experience of conflict, the experience at liberation and subsequently created different, has informed our realities and has informed our understandings of gender, of equality, and most critically of identity. That there are many multiple identities now that need recognition in a way that they perhaps didn't have in the immediate aftermath of liberation. And with Bangladesh now hosting different people of different citizenships, no citizenship, stateless communities, that also requires a different lens to be taken on how we understand the question of equality and who it applies to. Another question I think was raised about the identity of women and what characteristics of women we actually look at when we're talking about equality. Are we looking at women as members of families, as mothers, as sisters, as daughters? Are we looking beyond the categories of the gender binaries? How inclusive can we be? What perspectives do we take in Bangladesh? Do we look beyond the family at other aspects? Do we look at what happens to women in the community? Particularly a question was raised about women in workplaces? How much is the women's movement also inclusive of different women, women who have disabilities, women of different ethnicities, who speak different languages, of different religious communities, of religious beliefs or no beliefs, and so on. Another crucial point I think that was raised in the discussions and also partly in the papers and the comments on them was about the approaches taken by the women's movement, whether an approach which has embraced the punitive, perhaps at the cost of the reparative, perhaps at the cost of the restorative, is also something for us to be looking at now after 50 years. One question that came only very slightly, I think, but was really crucial, and we kind of ended with that, is what happens with questions about proof, evidence, documentation. It's one thing to recognize we have rights, it's another to realize them. And to realize them, we have to engage with those processes. And they're more complex now as we live in both a real life and offline space and an online space. So we didn't discuss very much today about issues around cyberspace and what that means, but I think that those are questions that in a way are raised somewhat by the conversation we already had. And the final and most crucial point I think we heard in the discussions was about the need to mobilize and to organize. Zakir Hussain raised a comment to the speakers about the importance of organizing and the importance of mobilizing in order to realize rights, and particularly to mobilize from the ground, to claim rights. That much of our conversation still remains about constitutional provisions, non-implementation of laws and so on. But the need is to create a countervailing power of women against patriarchal values. And also, as he said, to change the electoral process so that women are politically empowered. And I think that goes back very much to what both Jaya and Monia had been speaking about in their papers, is how do you posit that countervailing power? How do you also make it happen? So I think this has been a fantastic session. I apologize to all of the amazing people who are on this session, each of whom could have been asked to speak for 20 to 30 minutes to an hour each. I'm going to call some of them out and thank them. There's Khushi Kabir here, there's Geeta Sehgal, there's Tazeen Murshid. There are just far too many people that I can see. Sonia Khan, who are all people who will give papers in their own right in different places. I really thank you from all of us at UAP Sales and Blast that you made the time, that you joined us here today. And we'd like to invite you all to come back early tomorrow morning, Bangladesh time, 9 sharp. That will prove your dedication. Coming in at 8 o'clock on a Friday is a bit easier than that. But tomorrow we have a fantastic panel on recognizing rights and remedies. We have 2 young speakers, Salwa Haq, who's a PhD scholar at New York University, and Takbir Huda, star of the young scholarly generation in Bangladesh, we all know. And they're speaking on, Salwa is speaking on a fascinating subject about shalish and mediation and the use of technology, amongst other things. Takbir is speaking about the road safety movement and compensation demands, a very contemporary issue. And they'll be joined by some remarkable and I think leading scholars as well, Dr. Aziz Haq, Dr. Dina Siddiqui, and I think, Shrek, you'll have to remind me about the third speaker.
Manan Ahmed.
Yeah, Manan Ahmed, Dr. Manan Ahmed, thanks. So it'll be a fantastic session tomorrow morning, 9 sharp. Please grab your tea, coffee, and come and join us then. And thank you very much for being with us today. And the last question, I should mention that these papers will, we hope, be part of a volume which is going to be coming out next year. And the discussion, the conference today and tomorrow, we hope will also continue in new iterations in the new year as we march towards 4th of November 2022 and the 50th anniversary of our Constitution. Thank you all for being with us today. Happy Human Rights Day. If you have any orange, please flag it at the camera before you take off. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.